It's good to see everyone here this morning, and good to be back, to be with you again. We had a wonderful trip up to North Carolina. Got to be with some fantastic brethren up there at Newton. And then on Sunday evening, we're able to go up and preach again at Spruce Pines. So that's about an hour away. All of that is just a wonderful trip, and preaching God's Word and meeting new brethren that I haven't known before, and some that I've met before and enjoyed in the past. But it was a great week, and I appreciate that opportunity so much. If you're ever up that way, stop in at Newton, North Carolina, or Spruce Pines. Those are two good congregations of brethren there. I'd like you to turn in your Bible to Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1. I want you to notice with me verses 1 through 4. As you're turning there and you're thinking about what is this that you're holding in your hand, and you've got four gospel accounts of the life of Christ that pertain to the evidence of Him. The evidence of Jesus is presented so that people could know they've got a good reason to believe in Jesus as the Son of God, that God came in human flesh, that He walked among us as a combination of God and man together. And that's a bold claim. But the evidence was so strong that they wrote it down to say, here's the evidence of that. And some of it was pulling from prophecies of the Old Testament, like Isaiah 9:6, that this child would be born and we'd call him Mighty God. Or Malachi chapter 2 would speak of him in the terms of him being from everlasting. And so you had the prophetic word saying that a Messiah is coming and He's going to be a child and He's also going to be God at the same time. Then you have these New Testament writers writing, like Luke is sitting here to a governor and saying, here's the case. If you want to check out the evidence, here's the evidence. And he says, I know a lot of people have taken in hand to write a narrative. I'm doing that right here so that you may know the certainty of those things of which you were instructed. I want you to know just how sure it is that Jesus is God among us. That's a fantastic claim. The fantastic evidence goes with fantastic claims. For example, when you're talking about somebody being God, you're going to have to talk about miracles. Of course, He worked miracles as part of the proof that He was the Son of God. John chapter 1 says that He was in the beginning. He was all the way back. He was God with us. And then He became flesh and dwelt among us. And so His footprints should be there in the sand of time, in the sands of history. We should see the evidence that God walked among us in the flesh. That's what Matthew takes in hand to prove. That's what Mark takes in hand to prove. That's what Luke takes in hand to prove. And of course, John takes all of that in hand to prove it. Of course, that's so outlandish in some people's minds that they just dismiss it, that's impossible. But these men did not lose any credibility. No one thought, after they considered the evidence, that these men were delusional, or maybe not all there, maybe crazy men. They were not called that because their case was strong enough to stand, because people knew Jesus did work these miracles and His tomb was empty just as He said it would be, and there was nobody, no physical body of Jesus that somebody could produce and say, you say He was raised from the dead? What's this? They couldn't do that because the strength of the evidence was so powerful that you had to know these men who are preaching this We may not want to believe them, but we cannot attribute insanity to these men. The evidence that God actually walked among us was powerful enough in the very city in which they had taken Jesus with lawless hands and crucified him. It was so powerful, it was lasting in its effect, so that we can know, as Luke told Theophilus, you can know the certainty of these things. Well, what I want to do for the majority of the lesson this morning is to, in addition to what we've just quoted, and we just gave a small sampling and a small summary of the biblical evidence that was passed along by inspired men, I want us to go outside of that and appeal to those who had something to say about it outside the biblical records, maybe historical references to this. And so I'd like to look at the historical evidence outside the Bible for a little bit and then come back and pull it all together. What kind of references? There are those who say Jesus was not even historical. Those who say such things lose their own credibility because the powerful evidence of Jesus Christ, just in the gospel accounts and the power that it had to change lives and that it changed the course of human history. Christianity could not flourish if there was no credibility to the claims of Jesus' miracles and his resurrection. Take that out and there is no Christianity. It does not survive one day in Jerusalem where they had crucified Jesus. So what are the historical references? And what would you, if you just tuned out the four gospel accounts, and then you just wanted to go outside of the gospel accounts, what is there outside of those references that complement and that help to verify the things that the gospel writers did write? And one of the things that struck me as I was thinking about that, as I was thinking, what kind of historical references do you expect? Now really, when it comes down to the annals of history, I don't expect to be known in history records. Now, history records are, especially ancient ones, are hard to survive anyway on their own. 2,000 years from now, I don't know that there would even be a historical reference to myself or to the Gardendale Church of Christ as far as that's concerned. I don't know that. It seems that you would have to do something very, very significant to even get mentioned. So I'm looking at history as it's developing now, and usually only those who make some kind of historical mark, maybe through and by means of politics, so that you become known. Maybe it is through some fame such as being a movie star or something of that nature. You might come down in some historical writing of some sort. But Jesus wasn't a politician, and he wasn't a movie star. And so how would you find a Jew, just a common Jew, to become recognized in the annals of historians? Those who would take in hand to write about somebody, what would you find about a Jew? He's not a political figure. And in this case, he's one that Jews didn't like as a whole. He was despised and Jews as a whole are despised themselves. And so you don't want to make a lot of reference to them because they are despised. And another thing, when you think about public recognition and getting your name in the history books, public recognition would have to go beyond those who would be just the believers in him. And you'd find that to be very scarce as a general rule. Records are scarce of anything from Judea. Ancient record keeping of anything from Judea to Rome, unless you're in the political limelight, would be very, very scarce. So I'm not expecting to just find lots and lots and lots of things, because historical records were not kept very well about everything and about everybody. So when you do look at them, here are some things that seem to really become very impressive. When you piece it all together, I'd like us to consider the writings of various ones. Some of these are direct quotes. Some of these are quotations maybe 200 years after this quote, but the quotation was around for quite a while to be recognized by those who read very much. Thallus is one of them. He's a writer in about AD 52, which is just a few years after Jesus died on the cross. He's quoted by Julius Africanus, who quotes Thallus in 2:21. And he says, in regard to this statement of Thallus, he says, Thallus, in the third book of his histories, explains away the darkness at the time of Jesus' death. You remember at the time Jesus died, which is in the middle of the day, that suddenly it just became dark. And of course, if that happened, you'd expect people to have made note of that, because that would have been a very curious thing, to have complete darkness in the middle of the day. Well, Thallus tried to explain that darkness because it happened. He explains it as an eclipse of the sun, and Julius looks at that explanation 200 years later, and he says, Thallus explained that, but it doesn't seem reasonable to me that you could explain that darkness as an eclipse of the sun that time of year. Now, first thing that stands out, of course, is if it never really happened, then, of course, nobody would have any business or any need to explain it. But they were explaining it. Secular sources were trying to explain the darkness because it happened. It was real. Julius was correct that it is not likely to have happened because it was at the Passover. And the Passover happens during a full moon. And full moon and a solar eclipse don't take place at the same time. In fact, it just never takes place at the same time. You can't have a full moon and a solar eclipse at the same time. And that's why Julius says, Thallus, he explained it as an eclipse, but that's just not a good explanation. But the point that we're making is historical references to events surrounding Jesus Christ are amazing when you start to look at those. Phlegon in 140 AD, and he's quoted by Origen in the 200s, and he says that Phlegon was explaining the darkness that was experienced that day that Jesus died. But he is also quoted, Phlegon was also quoted by Philippon in the 500s, and so we've got various ones quoting from sources that said that they're trying to explain what happened on the day that Jesus died. Then you have a Roman historian, Tacitus of the first century, and his statement becomes very, very crucial. He says, but neither human help nor imperial munificence, nor all the modes of placating heaven could stifle scandal or dispel the belief that the fire had taken place by order. And he's explaining the fire that burned Rome. Therefore, to scotch the rumor Nero substituted as culprits of this fire and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, and get this part of his quote, whom the crowd styled Christians. In other words, Nero blamed Christians. But he explains, where did Christians come from? He says, Christus, the founder of the name Christian, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius, exactly what the gospel said. And by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, exactly what the gospel said. And the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment. In other words, by killing Christus, that kind of put it in check for the moment, only to break out once more. In other words, something happened. It put all the disciples to silence, and it seemed to have done the job of quieting this movement for the moment, but then all of a sudden it breaks out again. And so Tacitus agrees, at least with the facts that you're seeing in the gospel, is here's a Roman historian who says, here's the origin of this group, and here's how this man was put to silent, and then all of a sudden his followers just exploded again, breaking the silence again. And of course, he's not going to explain that, but the Gospels explain that. Because Jesus was raised from the dead, that's why it broke out again. Now, then you have this statement by a Jewish historian of the first century. He is a consultant for Jewish rabbis, and he's a military commander under Emperor Vespasian. And he says, quote, "At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive accordingly. He was perhaps the Messiah concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders." Again, over and over, we're seeing corroborating evidence outside of the biblical records, and none of them contradict the biblical records at all. None. There are none of the historical references that we could look at that say it didn't happen, no miracles happened, no missing body, no crucifixion. None of that. You do not find that in the historical references outside of the biblical records. Plinius Secundus lived from 23 to 79. He's called Pliny the Younger. He was considered one of the greatest letter writings, and governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor said in a letter to Emperor Trajan in one, or at least we found the record that was given to Trajan, and it says they, Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God. Now, what we're seeing today, modern so-called liberal scholarship, modernist, sometimes set forth the argument that Jesus was just a man, and then as time went on, then the legend kind of developed him as more than he really was, and so he reached somewhere in the 300s godhood status. But what we're seeing in the historical references outside the Bible is that early on, in the first century and the second century and the third century, he had already been thought of as God reaching that status, or he was already thought of as God come in the flesh. And so it was not a matter of legends developing later on. That's what they thought of him immediately in the first century. Right when he was alive and when he was on the cross, soldiers said, truly this is the Son of God. There was no development of a legend later on. It was immediately the case that they thought of him as God. Jesus was recognized as God immediately. Suetonius, Roman historian and analyst of the imperial house, says, as the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, Claudius, expelled them from Rome. Well, that's what the book of Acts says, that Claudius expelled these Jews from Rome. But this historian says it was because of Chrestus, and that's a form or a spelling of the word Christ. Just like Pontius, Pilatus, Christ, and Chrestus, those are words. It's the Greek misspelling of Christ. And that validates Aquilus and Priscilla being expelled from Rome, as we see referenced in the book of Acts. Again, everything that's outside of the books of the Bible corroborate what it says, never contradicts what it says. Lucian of Samosata, a Greek satirist, in the account of Lucian in about 170 said, the Christians, you know, worship a man to this day. This is almost 200 years later. He says, to this day, Christians worship a man, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. Now, here we're seeing a man was crucified, and still his followers were not ashamed of a crucified man, and they go ahead and worship him. Now, the whole idea of crucifying was to shut them up and say, look, he's just a man. And a man to be pitied and shamed and scorned because of crucifixion. But he says 200 years later, they're still worshiping him. Again, the evidence outside of the biblical records agree. He was crucified, and yet Christians continued to worship him 200 years later as of Lucian's writing. And so over and over, we are seeing the evidence build, and the momentum of that evidence can only accommodate the historical records that we find in the Bible. Phlegon, Greek historian, in the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, which figures to about 30 or 33, he says there was the greatest eclipse of the sun. It became night, and he says in the 6th hour of the day, which was noon. Here's someone outside of the biblical records telling the exact time of day that eclipse occurred. And he says it was so that the stars even appeared in the heavens. There was a great earthquake in Bithynia. Other things were happening that he makes note of. And many things were overturned in Nicaea. But what he's doing is he's correlating without even consciously thinking about it. He's just telling a fact. And it's the same fact that you find in the gospel records as well. He correlates the darkness of when Jesus was crucified. In addition to that, Hadrian appeals to the Caesars and the judges to examine Christians fairly and not just react to Christians out of mere prejudice, but try to deal fairly with them. Why? Because he was seeing Christians being persecuted unfairly. Well, that's in agreement with what we see in the Gospels and in the records of the epistles, and then in addition to that, the book of Revelation. Persecution against Christians was rising. Paul telling Timothy that you will suffer persecution. Well, Hadrian's trying to say, at least try to treat them at least fairly. He says, I do not wish, therefore, that the matter should be ignored without examination, so that these men may not be harassed, nor an opportunity given for malicious proceedings to be offered to informers. If, therefore, the provincials can clearly show their charges against these Christians so as to answer before the tribunal, let them pursue this course only, but not just petitions and mere outcries against Christians. For it's more fitting, if anyone brings an accusation, that you should examine it. And his point is, be at least as fair with them as you would anyone else, showing that there was some outrageous unfairness against Christians going on at that time. And then Marabar Serapion. This is in the British Museum, an old Syriac manuscript, in which he makes this statement, very revealing. It says, what benefit did the Athenians obtain by putting Socrates to death? What did they get out of that? What happened after that was that they suffered famine and plague came upon them as judgment for their crime. Or the people of Samos for burning Pythagoras. In one moment their country was covered with sand. Or the Jews by murdering their wise king. Who would that have been? Well, that would have been Jesus. He says, what happened to them? After that they murdered their king, what happened to them was that their kingdom was abolished. Speaking of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. God rightly avenged these men. Well, that's exactly the terminology of the book of Revelation. God avenging these men. That's the statements that you find in the book of Matthew 24. God avenging the blood that was he brought upon them. The wise king, he says, lived on in the teachings he enacted. In other words, by killing him, you didn't accomplish anything, because his popularity kept growing even after that. So all of that's just in agreement with the biblical writings of the apostles, Matthew and John, and the prophets, Mark and Luke. All the secular and spiritual history agree with the New Testament. And here are about 4 basic points. Every ounce of historical reference outside the Bible agrees with these facts. Number 1, Jesus was real. He was a real man. Second of all, Jesus was crucified at the hands of Pontius Pilate. That's not just something the Bible references. It's not made up by these men. The evidence outside the biblical records agrees with the biblical records. Jesus was crucified at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Jesus was more influential even after his crucifixion than he was before it. And so crucifixion didn't stop the movement, because something else happened to make it start up again. And that was the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And fourthly, Christians didn't start worshiping him as God centuries later and make a legend out of him. No, they were worshiping him as God in the first century. And they suffered persecution long afterwards because of their admiration and their worship of this Jesus of Nazareth. So all the evidence fits the biblical records as absolutely historically right. Then you get inside some Jewish writings. And in their Babylonian Talmud, which was not long after the first century, but it says, quote, on the eve of the Passover, Yeshu, which is the word for Jesus, was hanged for 40 days before the execution took place. A herald went forth and cried, he is going to be stoned because he's practiced sorcery. What is this Jewish historical record telling us about Jesus? Well, they're trying to explain his miracles. They're saying it's sorcery. But inasmuch as you're trying to explain the miracle and you're trying to say that it's sorcery, that's still agreeing that the records of the apostles about miracles is true. Not only that, but he says they were going to stone him. And that really is the common way of Jewish execution, but somehow they didn't wind up doing what they planned. He was crucified or hung on a tree instead of being stoned. And so it says the herald went forth. He is going to be stoned, and because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy, anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf. But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover. Again, all the evidence of friends and enemies of Jesus, those who were his friends and those who were his enemies, all the facts agree from both sides. So the early believers agreed, and the unbelievers explained his miracles. No one defended Jesus at his trial. And instead of being stoned, he was crucified, hung on a tree. The early believers, therefore, were immediately convinced of his deity and said so and stood their ground and were willing to be persecuted to the death because they knew the afterlife was established for them in Jesus Christ. They were not afraid to die. They were willing to be persecuted to the death because the evidence for Jesus was tremendous, and there was no way to take that out of their heart anymore. There was harmony with the Jews on the prophetic word. The Jews would not have wanted to say a child would be mighty God, but that's what their record said. And Psalm 110 said, David said, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And so it agrees with the Jewish prophetic records. The evidence that the apostles presented fit that testimony tremendously and to the T. There was therefore immediate consent about Jesus' deity, not a legend that built up over time. And then Luke says, I'm writing to you, Theophilus, a Greek ruler of the time, so that you can know the certainty. You can know the things that are most surely believed among us. And the point he's making is God came and he walked among us, and he was a part of us. God actually walked among us and gives you an opportunity of eternal life. The greatest opportunity in the world. Think about that. You have an opportunity for eternal life. If you need to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ because the evidence you find to be fully satisfying, to be fully convicting, we can help you in your obedience to Jesus. Don't miss out on the everlasting life Jesus died to give you. If you need to come, please come now as we stand together and sing this song.